I go back to the beginning, my beginning in drum corps, and I was very blessed to be in a situation where my small town drum corps had representation.
I'm going to turn into just a fanboy for a second, because Darian, I remember seeing you on the podium. And that was seeing you, that was the first time I'd ever seen anybody like that.
What's up, guys? Darian Sanders here. We are going to spend a little bit of time talking to Jim Prime Jr., who was the first Black DCI Hall of Fame inductee. He's worked with several notable crazy corps. It's pretty awesome. And Bryen Warfield, who is actively the co-brass caption head for the Mandarins. And we're just going to talk today about some perspectives, some stories, just kind of our journeys of life in drum corps and where the activity has come from, where it is now, and hopefully where we can go in the future. So in hearing the stories, it was really cool to kind of talk through and hear little bits and pieces. And I know for me, one of the cool things was, Jim, you said that your dad, worked on a drum corps, was a family thing as well, like siblings and just watching other things. Were there key factors and mentors, maybe your dad or maybe other people, that really fed into and poured into your life and into your musical career to make you want to do drum corps even more, or things that led up to that as well?
Well, certainly my father was besides being a father, he was a great mentor also. And being that I turned out to be an arranger, obviously, I in a lot of ways, I followed in his footsteps. My father was also, very accomplished judge in the activity, both bands and drum corps. So I never kind of took up that mantle. I never thought that I would be very good at it. As a matter of fact, I think he was very good at it. However, from the arranging point of view, that's definitely where I got my foothold. And I can still recall many a night. He was a carpenter by trade, carpenter and a tile maker. But in the evenings, he would be downstairs with his little organ, which was about 2.5 octaves. And he would be doing these arranging things. And of course, everything then was by hand, and he would write out the parts by hand. And with our little drum corps, we could learn, 30 seconds, at a clip. So we rehearsed, one time a week for a couple hours, whatever. And that's how it was done back then, very differently. But it was quite inspiring to me to see what he did. And he also taught the organization. So it was, right in front of me. And when all was said and done, I think at different times, and as a matter of fact, my wife and I were discussing this the other day, at different times, I wanted to be a mathematician or a math teacher. I wanted to be a meteorologist. I remember that, and a few other things, but settled in music education. And that's where it ended up. In terms of drum corps, oh man, you name any arranger and I've listened to their things over and over again. I grew up, on drum corps, so I still have quite a collection of vinyl records through the years. And anybody who knows me knows I'm a big fan of the activity. So I can basically tell you who played what in which year. Probably what place they finished in general terms, and all those kind of things. So
I love it. Bryen, what about yourself?
So my parents weren't nearly as involved in the activity as Jim's parents were, but I do come from a musical family. Everybody in my family has played or still continues to play and sing. My mom was a viola player, played piano. Dad played clarinet and piano. My older brother, we were in high school marching band together. We did the parade drum corps together. He was a trombone player. Now he plays professionally just in Indianapolis and records and tours and whatnot. My sister, she was a saxophone player. And now she does a lot more musicals and whatnot down in the Indy area. I'm a younger brother. He played saxophone and he does arranging and whatnot too. So I think the idea of music in our family was something that was pretty big and important and significant to all of our lives. A lot of that was cultivated through high school marching band. For sure. And that was something when my older brother, myself, my younger sister, when we all were in high school, that was the thing that we all did. And then with that came drum corps for me and the bug of being a really good musician. That really cultivated itself through the activity. So I owe a lot of that to my parents. And now being a caption head, my parents still ask and they still want to know, what it is that we're doing and how the season's going and things like that, much in the same way that they did when I was marching. And they're always going to continue doing that just because that's the link that ties us as a family unit all together. So yeah.
No, that's awesome. And that kind of ties into where I want to go next with just the understanding of the differences in the perspective that we have on the different platforms that are going on right now, between that we have on the field with drum corps and then all the different winter activities and arts things as well. But then you take it from there and you go to the stage, and you have the Broadway stage, and you have these dance recitals and all these other aspects, and you have concert halls and orchestras and all these concerts. What's your perspective on that, of how they parallel and how they coincide?
Well, I certainly can speak to that. I have been a fan of drum corps, of course, almost my whole life, but I'm also a fan of anything that has to do with anybody performing, I think. And I think I've always had this fascination, though, with the sense of ensemble, like how an ensemble becomes a unique organism. And I think I got that certainly from drum corps as a young person, that it's just one of the few places in life that you learn how to be a teammate, in the sense that your contribution affects everyone else's contribution. And it's like I said, the ensemble becomes an organism. So I am so fascinated with ensembles that I just go and seek it out. And I seek out the excellence all the time. And even to this day, I discover things that I wish I had known when I was so much younger, and organizations I wish I had seen so much sooner. But in time, it all comes out. But I think that's it. That sense of ensemble, which I got from a very young age, being in the drum corps, and of course, along with that comes this sense of friendship. I mean, I still, my best friend to this day is someone I met in the local drum corps when I was that young. And although he lives in Texas, many miles away, he's still my go-to guy. He's my best friend. So it all comes out. And as I get older, I can appreciate more and more and more that very first experience that I had in this little local drum corps that I came from.
Yeah. So, Jim, you bring up a good point, the idea of ensemble. For me, the perspective is a little different in that same vein of, for example, that Scheherazade, and that piece is so synonymous with the activity and the interpretation that the Vanguard took in 2004. And compared to what we did in 2014, compared to what the Chicago Symphony would do, the effect is the same thing, but three different interpretations of that piece, for example. Or you listen to some of the older arrangements of Tchaikovsky, that the regiment that they've done for years, just over time, and how that compares to what somebody would do on stage, or an arrangement of it for like a tuba euphonium ensemble. I remember my undergrad, we had an arrangement of the last movement of the Fourth Symphony, and how different people will go about doing things like that. So I am always fascinated with how ensembles tell that story from a different perspective, and things like that. I think that's something that's really unique and interesting, and it makes it cool because the affect of that story can be different. It can be the same, but it can also be different depending on who's in that ensemble and how they choose to tell that story and the interpretation of that. So
absolutely. And the perspective that we jump into as coming from different backgrounds at different times in different seasons of both our journey as individuals, our journey as a whole, as a culture, but then also our journeys from the different ensembles that we come from and what we can contribute and bring to the table. So it's beautiful to look at that, but then to also think and to shift and say, like, man, from the time when Jim started in drum corps to the time now that you are currently teaching in drum corps, how have we seen, or how have you seen the activity shift and evolve and grow? What are some core things, maybe, Jim, that even now as a huge fan of drum corps, what are some core things that you see now that were back when you marched, and you can still say, like, in the same aspect, the family, the camaraderie, the ensemble aspect of what we get to put together and what we get to bring to the table for others to enjoy is a beautiful thing. What's the consistent parallel from back then, or maybe what is something that has changed that you have seen that is beautiful, that is a new thing that is growing the activity?
Well, I think one thing that is consistent is this dedication to uniformity, the dedication to technique. One thing that certainly has grown is the openness and the allowance for individual expression within the ensemble technique and uniformity. So that is really broadened out, and that to me is very, very exciting. Because back then it was, you were an individual and you had to contribute, but the whole emphasis really was on, like I said, uniformity of technique and really doing everything perfectly. And I think the modern ensembles have that to a large degree, but they also have such a sense of expression now. There's so much an allowance for individual expression, and it's quite striking for me because I've been around during the evolution of the whole thing. So in one sense, there's nothing that is going to be revolutionary to me in the sense of a timeline, because I've experienced that whole timeline. But when I think back to what it was and what it is now, it's certainly quite a bit different. However, the essence of it all, as I said before, and what makes drum corps and what makes it valuable in our society is the fact that you have to buy in to the ensemble in so many ways, and we know that you have to buy in the sense of travel, in the sense of sleeping, whether we like it or not, in the sense of eating, and certainly in the sense that what you put into a rehearsal from an individual and an ensemble standpoint is what you're going to get out of the activity. And those are all great things. And you don't really, find that in too many other experiences that young people can have.
I think it's awesome, Jim, that you had mentioned the fact of like uniformity and technique and expression. I think the tools, that literally the equipment that we use, obviously it's this is going to sound bad, but it's more advanced than it was back in the like the 60s and 70s or whatnot. But it's the same. When we go to speak to judges after a show in critique, when we're talking to the membership about how to improve on a day-to-day basis when we're on tour, or right now in the winter camp season and things like that, playing the same way, using the exact same technique, being expressive. that is the same, and it's always going to be the same, because again, we have to tell a story, whatever the story is that each corps is going to put out in the summer. The way that we get that idea across is going to be through uniformity of technique and all that. But the other major aspect of it is the buy-in. You have to work with people that you may not know, or you just met, or you've known for 2, 3, 4 seasons, whatever the case is. Everybody's got to work together in order to make that story go. And if the teamwork isn't there, if the trust isn't there, if the love and compassion for each other isn't there, the story is not going to be what it needs to be for the audience. And then from a scores perspective, it's not going to be that way either. I mean, championships and placements and all that stuff aside, an audience will love a show whether it's in first place or last. It just depends on how it's being presented to that group. So, yeah.
And the cool part that you were talking about, Jim, with the consistency of what has been and what is still the excellence factor and the uniformity factor and the ensemble factor, I think coincides also, excuse me, with you, Bryen, with what you were talking about, just that love factor, but also what does it look like in the sense of to be able to trust and to be able to do that ensemble. Honestly, with where we are in society, with where we are in life, like Jim, you had a great perspective because your dad was teaching and you were surrounded by it. And so you could see yourself as a composer, you could see yourself in the activity. Whereas, for myself, when I joined the activity, like, yes, there were people of color in the activity, but sometimes it was few far and in between to see. And so what do we look and what do we see of ways of improving and honestly moving forward the activity as well, just with the inclusivity aspect of understanding that sometimes access is the biggest key. It's, everyone, especially coming off of these last few years in the COVID season and all those things, of getting your drum corps down the field. That's the reality that we are all facing. I don't care what drum corps you're in, whether you are the number 1 placement in D1 or whether you are, a DCA corps trying to figure stuff out. Like, everyone is still trying to find members and get those things, but also creating access for people so that they can see and understand and experience and say, hey, I see myself doing this, or hey, I see myself as a composer. Hey, I see myself as a co-caption head, or even the caption head or the arranger of this drum corps, because I see myself doing that. What do you guys feel about that?
Well, I think that's very, very pertinent. And I go back to my beginning in drum corps, and I was very blessed to be in a situation where my small town drum corps had representation, of the community. And believe me, I don't take for granted that was definitely a plus for my life and my life experience. I had friends from different backgrounds, running the gamut, and it very much came from drum corps. And the one thing we had in common was we got together and we worked together. And then also, socially, when you do that, you can't help but mix and get to know one another. So I had that from the very beginning, but I also noticed that was not the case throughout the drum corps activity at that time. And we're talking about the 60s. There were some situations where groups would only unofficially allow certain people in their group. I recognize that. I also was happy to see that although minority representation was limited, there were some groups that welcomed minorities, and then there were some groups that were majority minority. And I got to experience a few corps like that. And I was so excited to see that and befriended people in those groups. However, as time went on, fortunately, we've kind of evolved, I think, quite a bit. And sometimes it's hard to see because I think there's still a ways to go yet. But I think we've made a lot of progress in the sense that a lot more people do not feel inhibited, do not feel like they can't be section leader, they can't be section instructor, they can't be head instructor, they can't be director, because we now see examples of that. And although I think there's always going to be a ways to go, at least in the near future, I think there's progress, and I think that's a great thing. So once again, there's nothing striking to me because I've been in the activity all along and I've seen it go, and I've seen it progress. So I think it would be harder. I think it would be more striking if I'd taken 20 years off in the middle and not seen the developments. So I think I could probably speak on this a lot longer.
I think the idea of representation, and I know for me in my world, especially over the last 2-3 years, that's been my big mantra, is just the idea of representation in all avenues that I'm lucky enough to be in, especially with this activity. I remember I didn't think anything about it until I started marching, and you know, I'm gonna turn into just a fanboy for a second, because Darian, I remember seeing you on the podium. And that was seeing you. That was the first time I'd ever seen anybody like that. My colleague at the Mandarins, Rick, I remember watching when Drum Corps was on PBS and watching him do the solo and Moon Dance. And then Jim, with you, I remember the first time I read about you and being fascinated with the star shows, especially, you know, the early 90s, 93, and I remember reading up about you, and that was the first person you were the first person I ever had read about and learned about that looked like me, that was at the height of the activity, you know, and your name is synonymous with Drum Corps International, you know. And so for me, with both of you two, with Rick, another real good friend of mine, colleague of mine, Eric Prince, those people, just reading about those folks and seeing all of you doing your gig at the height of the activity, at the top of the activity, allowed me the chance to feel comfortable going out on a limb and saying, okay, I actually want to go and do this, not just being a fan and being on the sideline, but I want to just take a step and just go down that road. And even being a caption head now and kind of standing on all of the shoulders of what I consider the giants in the activity, and kind of adding on to that, I think it's important, but I wouldn't have had the courage to do what I've done without seeing people like me, you two, and countless others, being in the roles that you all have been in. And it's literally representation. You guys didn't have to say a word. You existed, and you both did your jobs. And so I can do the same thing too. And then the students that I run into that I've been lucky enough to teach at the Vanguard and the Bluecoats and Mandarins and whoever I'm fortunate enough to teach down the road, you know, hopefully I can carry on what other people have done for me from that perspective. So I think the representation piece is critical, but that also goes into making sure that there are no barriers of access for folks that look like us, but anybody who's in an underrepresented community. You know, it's eliminating those so that we can have representation, so that the progress can continue. So yeah.
Well said. And just to piggyback on that, I got to experience in my formative years as probably my later performing years and early years as an instructor, I got to experience Jim Elvord, which is, he's someone we have to go back and look at. And also like Ralph Hardiman, and later on, as I got into the 80s, I got to meet Frank Williams and others. And I could go on because there have been, in this idea of representation, I think it took us a while for women to really get their, place in the activity, and hopefully that's becoming stronger and stronger. And one of my heroes when I was much younger was a woman named Sandra Opie, who probably was one of the greats in the activity in terms of her ability to instruct brass and create some great ensembles. And that was back in the pretty much back in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. And she later became one of the prominent DCI judges. So that's this concept of representation is so important in the activity. And that's why I think we need to continue to emphasize that. We're not there yet.
Yeah, very much so. And which leads into this next and kind of our final question, but to me, it's a very important question, but I want to read it versus summarizing it, because I think it is worded in such a way that it had to make me think, but I also wanted to be super concise with it. What is the perspective on the future of marching music education and drum corps, and how the activity can best serve Black and ethnic minority communities going forward? And I think with that question, for me, like I want to also explain where I'm coming from, and even reading that question and looking at that question of understanding and knowing, being in the space that I have been in Broadway and in other scenes and other situations, by wanting representation and by wanting to see no barriers of access, and see people exist in these jobs. Truly, Bryen, like you were talking about, just existing in the jobs and being excellent at what they are and having the ability to stand on these platforms and do these things. That's not negating anybody that came before. That's not negating anybody that is currently in those positions and doing those things. I think it just has something to say with, hey, making sure that everyone is seen, everyone is heard, and everyone is understood. And sometimes by just being in places and positions and spot means more to people than you can imagine. Sometimes understanding by seeing someone doing what you potentially never thought that you could do says something. But more so, it's also saying, I'm not wanting you to put an unqualified person in those positions. They need to be just as qualified as anybody else. I don't care where your background is, what your ethnicity is, what your race is, denomination, anything like that, what you believe or where you come from. If you are qualified to do the job as my arranger, that's the person that I want for the job. I just want to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity to do that as well. And so I love the fact of the matter that there is the first Black Hall of Fame in DCI here having this conversation. I love the fact of the matter that there is a Black co-caption head here, on this conversation. The fact that we have a Black broadcaster for DCI, in over 50 years, we have seen and walked through all of these things. That's not negating anybody else or anyone else's platform. I just think that it's a beautiful thing for people to see and understand where we are in the activity, but also say, like, we still want to move forward as well. Like, because even with us in this conversation, we could have had a woman of color on here as well. Like, that's one of the things. Like, so it's always an aspect of you can do better, you can be better, but striving forward to take those next steps as well.
Well, I think in a sense, opportunity, will be the foundation of it all. I think now with certainly the expanded view of such things as scholastic music organizations, I think the more we can draw upon and expand those opportunities in minority areas and open that up to everyone, I think we get such a greater pool of candidates. And I think you said the magic word, qualified candidates, because with more opportunity, there are going to be more qualified candidates, more that can step up their game and participate in the activity, and not only participate, but excel in the activity. And I think when that begins to take fruition, I think there'll be more and more development in that area and progress.
For me, it is to a degree, where are we doing this activity at? By that I mean, we've got the regionals, for example, in these big, massive, beautiful stadiums around the country, and other major shows too. DCI West is in Stanford at Stanford University, and for example, but where else can we do shows? Where else can we hold clinics? I think some of the barrier of access that we have literally is just the means to be able to get audience members from the variety of minority communities, physically being able to get them to a show. What are we doing to make that easier for the students, younger students, because the younger students are truly the future of the activity. How are we making it easier for those students to be able to get there? I was lucky enough that the parade drum corps that I was in, the gentleman who was over the group was just at my church, and so we just rehearsed at the school that he taught at. Again, just being at the right place at the right time. And I remember when I was marching, most of the shows that I performed in were in predominantly white communities, because they had stadiums that were big enough to host those shows. I distinctly remember going through when we went through Swamp Tour and going through Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, and those were the only 2 or 3 shows where there would be HBCU schools that would go to a show. The only ones out of the 20 or 30 that we were doing at the time, that I distinctly remember seeing, like North Carolina A&T, or saying FAMU, or Bethune-Cookman, or Grambling. Like I distinctly remember seeing, their apparel and memorabilia and all that in the stands, and they were all sitting together way off to the side and whatnot. I remember that, and so that was cool. But why can't we have that in other parts of the country? Why does it just have to be there? Or when we do clinics, most of the clinics I remember us participating in, the communities were pretty affluent, so they had the resources to be able to bring us in, and there was an exchange of services that way. But why can't we do those in other communities or other areas or things like that? My younger sister, she teaches down in the public school system in Indianapolis, and that's one thing for her that is a pretty significant challenge, is her to be finding ways for her to be able to take her students to a symphony orchestra concert. If she had that opportunity, that might be the only time that her students have exposure to that, period, live. We can, YouTube and the internet is a fantastic tool, but it's one thing to see it online, and it's another thing to see it in person. So I think in regard to moving the activity forward, I think that's another aspect, is bringing the activity to those communities that may or may not have the opportunity to have their students or their parents or families or whoever just watch what it is that we do and expose them to the activity. So
beautiful, fellas, beautiful. Well, this is far from the last conversation and the time that we are going to kind of dive into these topics and just have these conversations. I think having open dialogue and conversation is key to moving our society forward and moving this activity forward, and creating opportunities in space and platforms for people to have these discussions, have these questions, and potentially even and put it out there to say like, hey, what are some other things that, you know, we would like to discuss and talk through and talk about. And so thank you, fellas, for being open and honest and vulnerable to share your story of who you are, for your thoughts of where you are. If I can ask, if you were standing on the press box at the field, you had any and all ready and waiting and listening to your last words at the end of your ensemble rehearsal, and you wanted to impart some wisdom on what to share or something specific, like a little nugget for this activity and for this community, what would you say or what would you have? Jim, I'll start with you.
I would absolutely declare that the mantra that what you put into the activity is what you will gain from the activity. And what you put into an individual rehearsal is the result that you'll gain from that rehearsal. And obviously that goes along with each and every performance that you have. So I would say do the best you possibly can at all times as an individual, and always remember your contribution to the ensemble, and what you do affects everyone else. Gee, it sounds a lot like society in general, huh? And allow for each person to have their unique design, which they were gifted with at birth, and also to draw upon their life experiences, which are also different for each individual. However, cherish the concept that we come together as an ensemble, everybody different, but in a sense, everybody the same and seeking the same thing. And in drum corps, it's excellence. And in society, I think it's love. So.
Beautiful. Awesome, sir. I appreciate that. Sir Bryen.
For me, it would be like just this idea of we're always making a first impression. There's always going to be somebody's opportunity to see the drum corps, a performance, a rehearsal, a lot, whatever the case may be. It's always going to be somebody's first time, and you always want to make sure that impression is the best quality that it can be. It's not, for me, it's not necessarily the idea of perfection, but we want to have a positive impact on whoever it is that is going to come and watch us play, rehearse, perform, do whatever, and so making sure that's done to the absolute best of your ability, and never losing the idea of that first impression and how important that is. That for me, I think is pretty critical, and that's what guides me on a daily basis, because inevitably there's going to be somebody that I meet for the first time every single day that I'm lucky enough to be alive, and so I want to make sure that impression is something they're going to have a positive impact from. So,
absolutely awesome, fellas. Thank you so very much for joining us. Appreciate you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I just want to thank Jim Prime Jr. and Bryen Warfield on their perspective and their stories. If you want to check out any more of the content that we have going on, just check out any of our social media accounts. We'll see you guys later.